Welcome to the second full lecture of international trade. What we're going to discuss today is going to be the Ricardo model of international trade. We're going to take a look at an example. We're going to scrutinize the assumptions of this model. And we're going to ask what happens if we relax some of the assumptions. And of course, we're going to also have a look to the model that goes beyond what we have already learned about Ricardo. We will see a little bit of the opportunities that give us more scope for further research. The Ricardo model has been presented, has been developed just to show the sources of comparative advantage. Right? The discussion about comparative advantage wants to determine why do countries trade, and if countries trade, is this of benefit? Does it bring a benefit with it for all nations, or maybe just for some of them? After trade has come into being, after leaving the autarky situation, then the next question would be, what happens if one of the countries or all specialize in the production of a good? Are there any benefits from specialization that differ from the benefits from trade? As an example, we will take a look at Portugal and England. This is the typical example you find in most textbooks. And let us stick to it because I think you have already heard about it, and it's easy to discuss things that we already have heard of. So the example, which of course was already presented by Ricardo in the 19th century, deals with Portugal and England, and both are assumed to produce two goods, wine and cloth. We can also see that in this example that Portugal has an absolute advantage in both goods, wine and cloth, while England has an absolute disadvantage in both goods. So in a situation like that, we just ask what happens if both countries leave the situation of autarky and engage in international trade. For example, England, which produces wine and cloth, decides to produce more cloth. How do you do that? Well, you release labor from the production of wine, and labor moves to the textile industry in order to be able to increase the output of the textile industry. Portugal, let's assume that Portugal decides to produce more wine and less cloth. So it releases labor from the textile industry, and this labor moves directly to the wine industry. Now, do we have a net gain from trade? In both countries. Let us take a closer numerical look at this example. Here in this table, we have the label requirements per unit of output. In England, we assume 120 units of labor to produce 1 unit of wine. We also assume 100 units of labor to produce 1 unit of cloth. In Portugal, we assume 80 units of labor to produce 1 unit of wine. In Portugal, we assume 90 units of labor to produce 1 unit of cloth. Now, what happens? If we assume that England decides to produce 5 units of wine less. Now, in the second table, we don't have units of labor anymore. We are now dealing with the units of both goods, of wine and cloth. Now, England decides to produce 5 units of labor less. In so doing, it releases 600 units of labor because we just multiply 5 times 120. Remember, 120 is the labor requirement for 1 unit of wine in England. So if we divide these 600 units of labor released by 100, which is what you need in terms of labor for 1 unit of cloth, then you get 6 units of cloth, 6 additional units of cloth. So by reducing the production of wine, releasing labor that moves to the textile industry, we are in a position to produce 6 units more of cloth. What happens in Portugal? Well, Portugal decides to import cloth, which is tantamount to say it wants to reduce its production of cloth by 6 units. In doing so, it releases 6 times 90 equal to 540 labor units. And if you divide them by 80, then you get the number of units of wine that Portugal will be able to produce more with the new labor moving from the textile to the wine industry. Right? And in total, we can see here that deducting the 5 units of wine that Portugal will export to England, we have an excess production of wine. So by turning from autarky to trade between England and Portugal, we have an increase in the production of wine, a total increase, and this is the benefit of trade for both countries. This is the gain. It's 1.75 additional units of wine produced in Portugal. And we have, of course, now 2 options. Either both countries continue to produce both products in trade, or both countries engage in complete specialization, which is to say that England concentrates on the production of cloth fully, uses all its labor just to produce cloth and exports cloth to Portugal. And Portugal concentrates its production and its available labor on wine. Now, sometimes changes in the use of labor, for example, if labor moves to the wrong industry, we could have an inefficient reallocation of labor. And just assume that England, instead of deciding to concentrate on the production of cloth, yes, it decides to concentrate on the opposite, on wine. And Portugal, instead of deciding to concentrate on the production of wine, says we are going to concentrate on cloth. Then you see in this table here what happens. You can see that England produces 5 units more of wine and 6 units less of cloth. Portugal produces 5 units less of wine and 4.44 units of cloth. And you can see here that the total changes in production yields a negative number. So by reallocating labor against comparative advantage, both countries have a loss of 1.56 units of cloth. So this is just to show what the benefit of comparative advantage, the benefit of having a trade pattern explained by comparative advantage, and what the disadvantage would be if you would have an inefficient reallocation of labor. This said, we can differentiate the gains from trade from the gains from specialization. And let us again take a look at the assumptions of the Ricardian model. We have two countries. The model is built in such a way that we could extend it and include more countries. This has been done. So it is possible to generalize the model. Then we have two goods in the basic model. The number of goods may be generalized too. What does not seem to be recommendable is to have both at the same time, more countries and more goods. This leads to a number of problems, as we can see in the literature. Very important is to know that we have only one production factor in the model, in the Ricardian model. We have only labor, and we assume that labor is totally homogeneous. So it's just one quality of labor. Yes, all of them are skilled or all of them are unskilled, but we don't have any mix. And we have a fixed supply of labor in each country, which is inelastic. It doesn't change. It doesn't react to the wage, because we assume the same wage across industries. And we of course assume that labor is mobile within countries, but not internationally. Technology. Technology is assumed to be different in both countries. This is, together with the quality of labor, the homogeneous quality of labor, the second most important characteristic of the Ricardian model. So we have different technologies. What does that mean? It means different production functions. Yes, or we have different labor units per unit of output in both goods, or we have different productivities. Yes, you might say, well, we are dealing with the productivity of labor. How come when labor is homogeneous that we have different productivities of labor? Well, this is one of the contradictions we have to live with. But again, we have different technologies. The amount of labor, the quantity of labor that we use per unit of output is different in both goods and in both countries. However, we have constant returns to scale, yes, so no scale economies. So nothing changes if the scale of production changes, yes, if the quantity produced increases or decreases, yes, there are no economies of scale here. We also assume no transportation costs, and we also assume that there are no trade barriers whatsoever. So we are actually dealing with two countries that might be neighboring countries and that are more or less of the same size. Another very important assumption in this model is perfect competition. Perfect competition on both, on the goods and the factor markets. Yes? So on the labor market we have perfect competition, and on the goods markets, yes, on the wine and on the cloth market. This means that all actors on these markets are price takers. Well, since we have perfect competition, then we should know that the price of a good, the price of wine or the price of cloth is then equal to the wage. We have assumed the wage is the same across industries, multiplied by the technical coefficient. It's a lowercase a that tells us how much labor we need per unit of output, right? So this would be, if we want to calculate the price is equal to lowercase a, or for example, the price of wine. Yes, the price of wine would be equal to the requirements, the labor requirements for 1 unit of wine, multiplied by the wage. Yes, and the same would apply to cloth. And since the wage is the same in the two sectors, when we just write the relative price, yes, so the price of cloth divided by the price of wine, or the price of wine, yes, divided by the price of cloth, yes, then we can set both prices, or this fraction of prices, they're equal to the labor requirements coefficients. Yes, in the denominator we have the labor requirement coefficient of cloth, and in the denominator we have the labor requirement coefficient of wine. Okay, so this is what simplifies the whole thing. Let us take a closer look now at autarky. As I mentioned before, when we study the Ricardian model, we differentiate between autarky. Autarky is the situation before trade. Then we have trade. Trade opens. We have international trade between both countries. And then we still go one step further. We ask what happens if we not only have trade between both countries, but if both countries specialize. So a total of 3 steps. Well, let us take a look at the price structure in both countries before trade, in autarky. And let us take first the relationship, the relative price of wine. So it's the price of wine divided by the price of cloth. In the case of Portugal, we just divide 80 divided by 90. Those are the labor requirements, right, of wine and of cloth. So it's 8 divided by 9. If we go to England, yes, then the same relationship, the price of wine divided by the price of cloth, is equal to 120 divided by 100, which is equal to 6/5. Yes, 6 divided by 5. So 8 divided by 9 is equal to 0.9, and 6 divided by 5 is equal to 1.2. This means that the relative price of wine is higher in England than it is in Portugal, right? So in Portugal, 1 unit of wine exchanges for 8/9 of a unit of cloth. In England, 1 unit of wine exchanges for 6/5 of a unit of cloth. And since 6/5 is larger than 8/9, England has a comparative advantage over Portugal in cloth relative to wine. And Portugal has a comparative advantage over England in wine relative to cloth. So relative prices define the comparative advantage. Of course, in practice, wages and exchange rates also play a role to adjust towards the trade balance. But we just leave that out here. We concentrate on the relative prices because we want to define what does the Ricardian model say about trade. Why does trade come into being? Why does specialization come into being? Now, having calculated in this example the autarky price level, relative price level in Portugal and in England, yes, and knowing that the relative price of wine is higher in England than in Portugal, what will happen if trade opens? Well, the international price of wine will be somewhere between the autarky prices in Portugal and England, right? So what we can learn at this point is that taking a look at the relative price of wine tells us what the pattern of trade might be. We see that England has a comparative advantage in cloth, so that England might export cloth. And we also see that Portugal might have a comparative advantage in wine, so that Portugal might export wine. So this already helps us uh, determine the pattern of trade between both countries. Now the next step would be to take a look at the production possibility curve that you can hopefully see now. What we have here is on the vertical axis, one of the goods is lowercase q1, and on the horizontal axis we have the second good, it's lowercase q2. As I mentioned before, we have a linear production function, yes, because the requirements of labor per unit of output are fixed, so that we have a linear production function. If you have a linear production function, the production possibility curve must also be linear. And as you see, it starts here at the point T1. Fortunately, the T is not here to see, but this is the supply of labor divided by the technical coefficient, the labor requirements for the production of 1 unit of product 1. Right? From here, curve moves down to the other point, or T2, equal to the supply of labor divided by the labor requirements for 1 unit of production of good number 2. Right? So let us now take a look at point A. Point A tells us what is happening in autarky. Yes, this is the point at which both countries are living in autarky before trade. No trade is happening. We can derive the amounts of good 1 and the amounts of good 2, wine or cloth, yes, that will be produced according to the prices that we have seen in the tables. Now assume that trade opens, we are trading internationally, and of course the price of wine relative to cloth is cheaper in Portugal than in England, so England might start importing wine from Portugal. But now assume that the production quantities that we have in point A, they just stay constant in point B. What is point B? Point B is the point at which both countries would be if trade opens, but they don't adjust their production. Why is B on another straight line? Well, because the production possibility curve has a slope, and the slope is equal to these two constant labor requirements for both products. The constant labor requirement for the second product divided for the constant labor requirement for the unit of the first product. Now, since after opening for trade, the prices of the goods change, we assume a different slope of this curve. And that is why point B is on the different slope, on the new curve. Now, if both countries adjust, so England releases workers from the wine industry that move to the textile industry, and Portugal releases labor from the cloth industry that move to the wine industry, what we get in the end is point C. Why? Because point C is the point that obtains if both countries specialize in the goods in which they have a comparative advantage. In addition to the production possibility curves and the curve of trade, what you see here is an indifference curve, right? The indifference curve just shows if the satisfaction of the consumer stays the same or changes because of trade. And of course, if both countries move from A to B, yes, they are very likely to enjoy a higher level of satisfaction. And even if they move on to specialization, this social indifference curve you see here is of course higher than the one we have in autarky. Yes, so the utility of moving to C really pays off. The other um, figure here tells us the same story. Yes, we focus here on the social indifference curve, and we move from A to B and from B to C. And this straight line here is nothing else than a parallel curve to the one we have here. This is how the relation, the price ratio changes after trade. Now, let me say some words about social indifference curves. In economics, in microeconomics, you might have heard that we derive a lot of concepts from individual indifference curves. Individual preferences can be represented in form of an indifference curves. But here we have a social indifference curve. We have an aggregation of individual indifference curves in two countries. Yes? Okay, so this is something that is very difficult to do because there are some theorems in economics, in microeconomics, that tells us that it is not possible to aggregate individual indifference curves, but there is a way around. Yes, there is a way around using excess demand curves, and there are also some other algebraic ways to do that. We're not going to discuss that in depth in the chapter that belongs to the prescribed readings. You have some paragraphs discussing the issue. We will not go further into that, but it's for you to know that we assume that the social indifference curve exists, even if we know that it has been criticized a lot and it is not possible to be easily derived. So we need a number of additional assumptions so that the income distribution does not change and so on. So this is just for you to know, but it's not necessary for us to go deeper into this matter. What I wanted to differentiate in this figure here is that A, again, is the position of autarky. B is the position that both countries reach. if trade is being opened. So we can see that there is a gain just from trade, even if production does not adjust, because at A we were at utility level A, and at B we are at utility level B, and B is higher than A, so there is much more utility at B than at A, which means that there are gains from trade. And moving from B to C finally, to a complete specialization of both countries. England produces only cloth and Portugal only wine. Also improves the utility. Countries move from utility B to utility C. And this shows that we can decompose the gains from trade into gains from international trade and gains from specialization. And both together are beneficial for both countries. Of course, by introducing social indifference curves, we introduce preferences, we introduce tastes, we introduce demand. And even if the Ricardian model tells us, well, if you have homogeneous labor in fixed amounts in both countries, and you have different production functions, you have a different technology in both countries, yes, then that is enough for trade to come into being and for specialization to happen. But even if, yes, we have different technologies and homogeneous labor, demand and a change in tastes can also give rise to more trade. Then it is possible to have just relying on differences in technology. So, as mentioned before, the decomposition of the gains from trade allows us to define very clearly what happens if international trade comes into being and what happens if both countries specialize. Now we come to a point where we start to relax the assumptions. So I've just mentioned what happens if tastes and if demand, yes, changes. Demand alone or changes in tastes and demand can also be a source of competitive advantage. Also, demand can determine the pattern of trade and the gains from trade. Another source of comparative advantage can be in form of increasing returns to scale. We have assumed, remember, a minute ago, that we have constant returns to scale in the Ricardian model. So now we relax that assumption and we just assume that we have increasing returns to scale. We also want to discuss institutional differences, the differences in taste we just discussed. Let me now say something about increasing returns to scale. Well, increasing returns to scale appear in different forms. We have internal increasing returns to scale. We have external increasing returns to scale. We have national ones and we have international ones. Now, what is the difference? Internal increasing returns to scale happens at the firm level. Yes, so the firm increases its output just at the firm level. The firm's average cost depends on the firm's output, and if the firm increases its output a lot, it might even uh, influence the market structure. Yes, for example, if we had perfect competition before, and let's say 5 or 10 companies supplying a certain product or service to the market, and a firm now increases its output to the point that it dominates the market, it produces 60% of the total output, then we are experiencing some monopolistic forces here, and market structure moves away from perfect competition. So this is one of the impact of increasing returns to scale. If a firm manages to get a very important share of the market by increasing its output, then also the power balance, the market power balance changes, then we are already entering a new market structure that has nothing to do with perfect competition. We are either in an oligopoly or in a monopoly situation. This, of course, changes the other assumption that we had in the Ricardian model, that we're dealing only with perfect competition in all markets. And here we would have imperfect competition in the goods market, maybe in one good. Yes, the other good would be still perfect competition, and labor would also be supplied under perfect competition. Now, what are external increasing returns to scale? Well, they are external to the firm, and they happen at the industry level. In this case, the firm's average cost do not depend on the firm's output, but on the industry's output. So assume there are 10 firms supplying a certain product or service. Yes, if the industry as a whole increases its level of output, then the costs at the firm level change. The difference between external and internal increasing returns to scale is that in the case of external increasing returns to scale, market structure always remains perfectly competitive. Why? Because the production shares, the market shares of the firms remain the same. There is no change. There is no individual firm that suddenly increases its share of the market. Let us now move to national increasing returns to scale. Well, national market means that the domestic market determines the limit of the market and the limit of the production before trade, right? So that a firm that starts producing, let's say, just for a region in which this firm is located, yes, or you have an industry, maybe the industry is also regionally concentrated in a certain area, and suddenly this a firm or the industry as a whole start to increase the output in order to cater to the whole domestic economy. Yes. So in this case, we have an impact on market structure if individual firms are expanding their output at the national level, and we do not have a change in market structure if it's the industry with constant market shares of the participating firms. What about international increasing returns to scale? This is the most common case that a firm or several firms start producing a certain good, service, and catering for the domestic market, maybe first for a region, then they expand, then they dominate the domestic market, and then they start thinking about expanding their production with exports and trying to enter foreign markets. So this is a way to increase the market for the firm's output. And of course, you could extend it by considering all countries in the world, more than 200, as parts of your market. But of course, if you are located in South Africa, then you would start to extend your output and selling your good or service in other African countries, and then you would slowly move on maybe to Latin America, to Asia, or to Europe, or to the US, or whatever. Yes? So this is what happens if you have international increasing returns to scale. Again, we could have the case of a single firm that extends its production in such a way that it starts exporting. Or you can have a whole industry that decides to cater not only to the domestic market, but also to foreign markets. Those would be the international increasing returns to scale. Now let me come back to institutional differences. Well, we assumed, for example, a homogeneous supply of labor, but we could also think about changes in the labor market. For example, imagine a labor market that is very highly regulated, where employers and unions negotiate a wage every now and then. But just assume that we have new unions, or we have a new regulation that says that employers can also employ people at a lower wage than the one that has been negotiated between employers and unions. So we have a kind of opening up of the labor market, and so we have labor market flexibility. Yes, so labor market flexibility might be understood as an incentive for some companies in order to expand their output by employing cheap labor. So you can see here that the institutional details of labor markets can also have an impact on the expansion of output in the sense we just discussed before, increasing returns to scale. So by employing more people, yes, then you can increase your output. And if the labor market is flexible, yes, you can adjust the negotiated wage, yes, to your needs as a firm. Then this would give way to an easier expansion of output. The same happens if in some countries, contracts are really enforceable, and in other countries, contracts are not enforceable because there is no rule of law. Property rights are not really defended by the legal system. So some companies retire, yes, from a certain market, because they don't see a chance to get their contracts enforced, or they stop working in that industry and they switch to another industry. So these institutional differences between countries, they can also give rise to trade, because companies might move to those countries where property rights are secure and where a rule of law is reliable. Yes, let me just sum up what we have said about the Ricardian model. Um, the the real original Ricardian model relies on one homogeneous production factor, which is labor, and on differences in technology across countries and goods. This model is a general equilibrium model and is a static model. Yes, and it deals with two countries, two goods, and one production factor, constant returns to scale, technologies that differ across countries and goods, and a country will export the good in which has a competitive advantage, and of course a lower autarky price than the other country. The other country will import the good in which it has a competitive disadvantage or a higher autarky price than the other country. Yes, so this is the pattern of trade that can be straightforward, can be determined straightforward by relying on differences in technology between two countries. Um, there are two equilibriums which are possible. One is incomplete specialization, so both countries continue to produce both goods after trade has started, or the complete specialization. In most cases, we have a complete specialization, or we have an incomplete specialization in the sense that one country specializes and the other does not. Well, there are several extensions of this model that are worth mentioning. One is to explore what happens if you have more than two goods. Yes, you have many goods, but you still have two countries. There is a nice paper written many years ago, in 1977, by Dornbusch, Fisher, and Paul Samuelson, and published in the American Economic Review, where these three economists have extended the basic Ricardian model to a scenario with two countries but many goods. They call it a continuum of goods. Yes, so infinite number of goods. So what you do in such a case, you have a number of goods, but you have for each good the ratio of the unit labor requirements, as we had in the 2 by 2 case. And in the case of many goods, you just have a whole chain of ratios of unit labor requirements. Right? You have this for both countries. So you write down the ratio of the labor requirement for good 1 divided by the ratio of the the labor requirement for good 1 divided by the labor requirement for good 2. Then you have labor requirement of good 2 divided by the labor requirement of good 3, and so on. This till n. Maybe you have an infinite number of goods, or you can also do that for 10 or for 20 or for 30 goods. You do that for both countries. So then you would see that some of these ratios are low price, and others show a higher price, like we had in the case of wine and cloth. So the lower end of the ranking, yes, you will have the comparative advantage of one country, and in the higher end you will have the comparative advantage, the goods in which the second country has a comparative advantage. And under free trade, each country will specialize in the goods in the respective end of the chain. Yes, so one country will specialize in the goods with the ratios of their labor requirements in the lower range, and the other country will specialize in the goods with their labor requirement ratios in the higher range. And the division between exports of both countries depends on technologies, tastes, and country size. Well, this is one extension of the traditional um, model. The second extension has been published in the year 2002 in the journal Econometrica by Eaton and Corton. And they try to extend the number of countries and at the same time the number of goods. Um, and this, of course, is not very easy to be done. The solution that they find is to assume random technologies. Yes, so the technologies are random and they keep on changing, so that you have a difference in technology, but they're not fixed. They are random and they change in the process after trade comes into being and when countries specialize. A final topic that I would like to mention here is what happens with the Ricardian model in the case of services trade, and particularly of digital trade. As you know, digital trade is e-commerce, is something that has been coming up over the past decade, and well, we have an growing number of firms that are engaged in digital trade, and not only in the developed countries, but also very much growing in the developing countries, and South Africa and other African countries are a very good example. Let me start with traditional services trade. There is one mode, as we call it, one kind of services trade, which is the cross-border services trade. This means that, for example, a firm located in South Africa, yes, just sells service to consumers or to another business, a B2B, in Botswana or another neighboring country. This service is rendered in the country in which the service is consumed. Yes? What does that mean? This means that the export of that service do not depend on the relative prices in the exporting country. Yes? So as you see, generally and traditionally, when we refer to the Ricardian model, we say, well, for trade to happen, we need to have a lower price under autarky in one country, so that other countries might get interested in buying that good from the country in which the price is lowest, right? But in the case of services, yes, rendered in the country in which these services are consumed, yes, the export do not depend at all on relative prices in the exporting countries. This means that the Ricardian model does not work for cross-border services. We have to look for other explanations for the trade pattern and for possible specialization. Now let me come to digital trade. Well, digital trade, we can identify five different kinds of uh, digital trade. We have physical products, advertised, ordered, and or paid for digitally, yes, but transported by normal means. For example, if you use Amazon or any other uh, provider in the internet of some physical goods, yes, this could be the case. For example, you buy some I don't know, CDs, or I don't know, any other, or some shoes, yes, through Amazon. Then you can also buy some digital products like music, like movies, like books, like software in the internet, yes, transmitted to purchasers via the internet and paid for via internet. Also, you can refer to Amazon for those products. Yes, digital products that you just buy in the internet. Then you have services provided remotely by digital means. For example, if you buy a software, it's an American software, and you need help, yes, to install the software or to adapt it to your hardware or something like that. Or maybe you buy something from a Chinese company or from a South Korean company, yes, and from South Korea, from China, from the US, you're getting help. Those are services provided remotely by digital means. So these first three kinds of digital trade, physical products, digital products, and services provided remotely, they more or less can be explained looking at the Ricardian model and looking for relative prices in autarky before trade happens. Now let me come to two kinds of digital trade where it's extremely difficult to apply the Ricardian model to. For example, data storage and computer applications accessible in a cloud. Yes, so I think most students use them, and we, of course, the lecturing staff, we also use them to store data and documents. Yes, so these are clouds. Yes, where they're located in places where the servers are. They could be in China, they could be in the US, they could be in Europe, they could be in Africa, they could be I don't know where. But it's not important where they're located. Yes, so that if you take the relative prices of the countries where these servers, these clouds are located, then it would not be possible to derive the trade pattern. The same happens if you take a look at web platforms serving an international audience and supported by advertising, um, like, for example, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, etc. Yes. Here in this case, we have network effects and very high relative autarky prices. So actually, the autarky price is not so important in determining the pattern of trade, right? Or looking for gains from trade. So again, we have 5 different kinds of digital trade: physical products, digital products, and services provided remotely. In those 3 cases, Ricardo seems to apply. And the 2 cases mentioned: data storage in computer applications accessible in the cloud, and web platforms serving an international audience like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and so on. In those 2 last ones, it's very difficult to apply the mechanics of the Ricardian model by looking for the relative autarky prices and trying to derive the trade pattern from there. Okay, I think that we have managed to take a good look to the Ricardian model, and please read the prescribed readings. I have also uploaded some additional reading material also related to the Ricardian model. I would very much recommend you to take a look. Thank you very much.